Well, the science is really clear on that. If you were a leader on the climate crisis, you would not be investing in any new fossil fuel infrastructure. And yet, what did this government do last week? It announced new plans for oil and gas licenses in the North Sea that will be running for decades. It's complete insanity.
This seems like an extreme length to go to, but I honestly don't know what else we can do to get the scientific messages out there about the urgency of the situation that we're in.
In this ClimateGenn episode, I'm speaking to climate psychologist and Deputy Director and Theme Lead for the Centre for Climate Change and Social Transformation, the CAST Centre, Dr. Stuart Capstick from Cardiff University, about why scientists who research aspects of climate change are deciding to protest in public and in some cases getting arrested. We discuss the role of scientists in society as a group that have for many years played a key role in informing policy. But what happens when policymakers are not listening, and the consequences mean risking the lives and the well-being of citizens, which of course includes their own family and friends and loved ones. Stuart is a researcher looking at many aspects of civil disobedience and the public's response to it, and has a lot to say that implies to me that more and more people with positions of authority are saying that enough is enough. The risks to our own existence are now too high. In the next episode, I speak with Nuri Syed Corsa from Fossil Free London, another group of activists specifically targeting the fossil fuel industry, their backers and enablers, by, for example, disrupting shareholder events and other tactics. Thanks for listening to ClimateGenn. You can subscribe on YouTube and all major podcast channels, as well as access podcasts early by becoming a Patreon backer. Thank you. So Stuart, it's very good to speak to you. I'm going to start by asking, for the scientist rebellion in particular, civil disobedience is more unusual because scientists and academics are part of an expert group that are informing society at different levels. Can you outline what drives you and your colleagues to defy the law, to take this step?
Yeah, it's a very good question, and it brings up questions of, first of all, where scientists fit in society, where we assume they should fit, where they should fit, as well as why myself and quite a few other people are beginning to say, actually, we need to push back against that. Just to take the second point first, what drives me to feel like we have to take drastic action is the essence of the climate crisis, essentially. So it comes as no surprise to anybody who works in this field or respects the broader science on this topic that this is a very dire situation that we're in. There are already a lot of appalling, terrible consequences locked in for people, around the world and natural systems. I'm sure I don't need to go into all that. But the reason why I'm prepared to take this sort of action is precisely because I think the harm and the risks and the dangers and just the vast scale and urgency of the crisis is such that it demands this sort of action in terms of civil disobedience, broadly speaking. Now, I feel that the climate crisis deserves this sort of action as well, coming back to the point about scientists and where we fit into society, because what we've been doing so far, and not to kind of say it's been pointless in any way, but it's not been good enough. How many times have we heard over the past 10, 20 plus years about the scientists' latest warning, latest report this, latest study that, the warning signs down to very fine detail of what governments, industry, etc. need to do to act has been there. We've been shouting it from the rooftops, writing in papers, giving PowerPoint presentations for a very long time, but that voice hasn't been heard anywhere near loudly enough. So the kind of median, mid-range estimate of what we're on a trajectory for is about 3.2 degrees of warming, so way above where we need to be. And there are few, if any, countries, societies, governments doing anywhere near enough. So I think, in summary, I think this is scientists' business to get involved in this and to sort of question how we fitted into this process so far. And also because time is so short and this is so urgent and such a morally compelling issue, I think that drives me to take part in this.
Just to begin to respond to that, have you experienced or heard any voices of disapproval within academia towards this kind of action? Or what is the response?
Yeah, I think, sort of reflecting on my own experiences and those of others, I think the response can be variable, shall we say. I mean, I work primarily in social science. My background as a psychologist, but I work with a range of others. And for my day job, linked to centres like the Tyndall Centre and the Centre for Climate Change and Social Transformations, which are kind of operating in that social science space and recognise, or it's their kind of focus is on the need for social change. I think I would describe my own experience of people's reactions as a little bit taken aback. But once people get over that, I've had plenty of people kind of at least mumble a kind of, well done, good on you kind of response. So I think often other academics and researchers don't necessarily know how to respond if they're not involved in such things themselves. But I think there is a kind of acceptance of it. Now, that's not to say that's the case for everybody. I'm aware of others who have work in different places and have different types of background who have had pushback and concerns about how this might affect reputations or credibility, etc. So I think those are kind of very live issues. And I think also there is this very long-standing set of assumptions and norms about what science is and what it should do. You do research, there's this idea of you being objective, disinterested, neutral, all these sorts of synonyms. You write the papers. You can give a talk in the evening somewhere, and maybe you can kind of get involved in something a bit more mainstream. But once it becomes, quote, political, I think that's where people start getting uncomfortable. Sort of straying from your original question a little bit, but my view is that really we need to, particularly in the place where we are now, to actually interrogate those norms and assumptions and say, why do we hold those? Are they still working if they ever did? And is there room for kind of moving beyond them and incorporating other things too?
There's a couple of points just from what you've just said. One is that you have strayed into one of my future questions, which is academics are more usually, we envisage this sort of thing where you're in line to pick up awards or knighthoods or peerages and portraits in the halls of the establishment and so on. This is a kind of a fantasy picture of the great academic life. What's changed in the roles and aspirations? I mean, I know you're saying that the climate crisis is the thing, but there's something inside. There's a switch that says, no, that's not actually working for me. It's this current generation of academics that seem to be coming from a completely different source, if you like.
Yeah, there's a couple of things that I would say that way of existing in the academy, if you like, that you outline is still very prominent, very embedded. There are good and bad things about that. Certainly the kind of incentive structure, if you like, for academics is just as it has been for decades, if not hundreds of years, that you want your research to be published in a top journal, cited by lots of people. You want to win funding grants. You want to move up the hierarchy, the ladder, get your own research group, et cetera, et cetera. So I think those structures are very much still in place. I mean, there are things that are getting more prominence in academia now, I think. So the impact agenda, there is this idea that our research shouldn't just be ivory tower. We should have impact. But the way that is defined is still very much in terms of making the status quo a bit better, to be a little bit flippant, but so I could get impact, for example, by demonstrating that an intervention I've done has been picked up by government in policy and that they're communicating something differently, for example. But somebody down the road at my university could get impact brownie points for helping an oil company extract more oil. It's a kind of a flawed mechanism, shall we say, particularly in the case of the climate crisis. It's hard to, for me anyway, and I think for others, to keep separate that idea of the long-standing, slow-moving, incremental ivory tower view of doing research from what we see going on out the window and in reports. So for me, at least, at some point, something's got to give. How many papers can you publish? How many presentations can you give? How many papers can you read and see? Every day there are dozens, hundreds of papers, but I still write and do research. It's my day job. I spend 40 plus hours a week doing it, and I like doing it, and I still think it's important. But there has been a growing nagging doubt that it's not enough on its own, shall we say.
Yeah, and you were talking about the things that you're dealing with in terms of the research. You're publishing quite stark messages. It's none of it's
Yeah.
particularly light reading, but it's actually critical that it does get to the policymakers and the policies are actually enacted. And when they're not being enacted and we actually find ourselves going in the opposite direction, really your main means to communicate after that is through the media. And the media itself it seems very ineffectual. And the media report even disturbances and protests. They're portrayed as, sometimes as outsiders, oddballs, hypocrites, people upsetting other people, getting in the way. When the public sees you taking this action, what do you want them to take away from it? Because obviously they're not going to see you protesting and say, "Oh, I must read his paper." I mean, what's the kind of thing that you're trying to convey to those people?
Yeah, I mean, just to come back to that in a second, but just to sort of pick up on the previous, and I think doing research we do and trying to get media coverage and so on, I think is really important. I mean, my research is more on the sort of public perceptions and behavior and policy and so on, but doing that research and trying to kind of speak truth to power, as it was, put things in front of policymakers, if that worked, brilliant. We wouldn't need to do this stuff. But I don't think it does. I think it's very easy to ignore or just say the right things or have targets. That's why I think we're pushed to take these other courses of action. And it's important to say that with that, things like civil disobedience, that this is, for me at least, very much a kind of a last resort. This is very much a kind of act of, we've tried pretty much everything else. This is plan Z. So to come on to your point about how these things are perceived, I think it's a very important one. The media reports this stuff in very variable ways. I think there is a new word that seems to be a favourite among the right-leaning media of mob. I've noticed this word being used quite a lot. Somebody's obviously decided somewhere that describing activists as a mob is a good way of painting them in a negative light. Now, I think there are cases where the public, the media, will react against this stuff. I've experienced both. I've experienced people issuing praise and being kind and nice and saying well done and thank you and this sort of stuff. And I think as a researcher, as a scientist, and for other scientists, it is important to kind of have a empirical evidence-based perspective on this stuff. So if we put it as a hypothesis, if your hypothesis is that civil disobedience and direct action and so on makes things worse, alienates people, makes action less likely to happen, is effectively counterproductive, then essentially we shouldn't be doing it, not least because it's not often a lot of fun. But my experience, my view at least, and the evidence, in as much as there is evidence, is that that isn't the case, that it is actually effective. There was a study published earlier this year, a meta-analysis of social movements opposing new fossil fuel projects, extraction infrastructure around the world published, and they found that where there was direct action and civil disobedience as part of those social movements, then it made these campaigns more likely to succeed over and above other tactics that were used. The classic case in the UK was, of course, the Extinction Rebellion protests, which came to a head in April, I think it was, of 2019. There was the advantage of novelty at that time, but it did make an enormous splash. I mean, media reporting of the climate crisis. We saw public concern, understanding, prioritizing of the climate crisis rise. It's very hard to attribute cause and effect, but I think that it was very effective in kind of sounding an alarm and forcing these issues onto the agenda. So all of which is to say that this stuff can be effective and is rarely counterproductive. So as a researcher, I know, and I'm currently collaborating on something with Bristol University, Oscar Birdland, who's an expert in civil disobedience and so on, who argues that most typically these types of activities are beneficial to a cause and rarely counterproductive. Now, we might move to some of the other types of actions which have aroused some of the most ire, shall we say, like Insulate Britain. I think a lot of people sort of recoiled against the tactics there. I think there are, not to comment on Insulate Britain particularly, but I personally think there are better and worse ways of doing things. If you take action that clearly sort of targets the bad guys, whether that's government or, let's say, oil and gas or investment banks funding this stuff, I think disruption is important. Civil disobedience on the edge of the law can be important for gaining attention as part of a campaign. But if your disruption is kind of interfering in the lives of people, then that can obviously feed into a narrative of why are you making ordinary people's life difficult? One point that's been made, and there's a little bit of research on this, although not peer-reviewed or published, is that one thing that these sorts of actions can do, including insulate Britain, is that whereas they might lead the wider public, the media, to not like the protesters very much, people sitting in roads and motorways, they nevertheless put the issues firmly on the agenda, so get people talking about such things. The Committee on Climate Change put its report out yesterday, or the day before yesterday, on the government's programme. One of the main areas they highlighted that the government hasn't been taking necessary action on was precisely about insulating people's houses. Now, I'm not claiming for 1 second they put that in there because of Insulate Britain, but most people in the country would have gone, oh yeah, house insulation, that's an issue, isn't it? Would they have remotely been aware of that stuff if it hadn't been for about 100, 150 people taking that action, sitting in roads and being shouted at and dragged out of the way? I doubt it. It's a pretty boring issue, isn't it, insulation, unless you've got that sort of stuff going. So all of which is to say that I think for the most part, especially if done well and carefully targeted, these sorts of actions are more helpful than unhelpful, but they do require some careful soul searching about whether you're comfortable with what you're doing or not.
I mean, I think that's a really good point about the Insulate Britain link to a real genuine need in the country as well. So if it does raise it in the awareness and the consciousness, that's definitely a good thing. You mentioned the word pretty a couple of times there, and Priti Patel has sort of been raising the stakes with draconian laws for protesting at the very time that activists are finding much more courage to speak out right across our society. Now, do you think are dissenting voices getting too near the truth, do you think? Do you think this is a response to a concern of where this is going?
You mean getting too near the truth as in kind of where the vested interests and so on lie, or?
Well, in terms of, yes, where the line where the government don't really want us to go, because they appear to be very open to vested interests around fossil fuels and so on and so forth.
Yeah, precisely. I think that probably is very much what's going on. I mean, you often hear whenever there is a protest involving civil disobedience and so on, the line is often wheeled out, which is that we respect people's right to protest. This isn't okay. I wonder whether what they really mean is you can stand on a street with a placard as long as we can totally ignore you and pay no attention to you whatsoever. The trouble with civil disobedience is it makes people pay attention to it, which is why you do it, but is also why the likes of Priti Patel doesn't like it. I mean, I think with the current government, we do have a situation where they are particularly populist, authoritarian, minded towards this sort of heavy-handed response. And so whilst if it had been another government where the stuff was happening, yes, likely there would have been some sort of legislative response. But because we have the government we do, they push that further than others would have. I think it's important to remember as well that whereas environmental activism, Extinction Rebellion and others were part of what drove this government's response, it was also about Black Lives Matter and other sorts of protests as well. So if things are getting too close to the truth, it's not just in terms of climate change and environmental activism, it's probably in other areas as well. One particular protest that Priti Patel very much didn't like was when Extinction Rebellion blocked the Murdoch presses, of course. Now, if you're getting close to the sort of, let's say, inner circle of government and influencers, then that's very much going to touch a nerve. And so, yeah, where you're kind of challenging the people who are bankrolling government, who are the mouthpieces, if you like, of government, yes, that's clearly going to touch a nerve. There is a school of thought, I'm not sure I don't subscribe to it, but that actually this is a good thing. So Roger Hallam, one of the founders of Extinction Rebellion, is of the view that the more people get arrested and thrown in cells and prison, the better. So in a sense, well, this is all grist to the mill. I don't really hold with that view. I don't think there's any point getting thrown in prison for the sake of it, least of all because it's a pretty miserable experience for people and harmful. But certainly, yeah, you're right, it raises the stakes. And I think we may well see some a lot more heavy-handed policing, a lot more heavy-handed sentencing and so on. There were some Just Stop Oil protesters who were given an injunction not to protest near one of the, was it distribution depot a little while back. The company was granted an injunction to keep them away from it. And they were arrested and put in prison for about a month at that point for standing on a grass verge holding placards. So if you can be thrown into jail for holding a placard, that raises some pretty worrying questions about our liberties, I suppose.
Okay. We talked a bit about the media response. We've talked about public perception. Have you spoken to many of your colleagues about how they genuinely feel about transgressing the law? Because it is quite a big step to do that, to glue yourself to something, to obstruct something, to deface something. Are they emboldened? Are they traumatized? I mean, what's the general feeling that you've got from people?
Again, I think it's probably fairly variable. So I'm a British citizen, born here, mostly brought up here. If things happen to me, I keep my British citizenship and passport. Now, there are, particularly in research and academia, there are a lot of people who are from other parts of the world, Europe and so on. And since Brexit, it have more sort of precarious positions. So I've had quite a number of people say to me who are in that position, I can't do this stuff. It's all very well for you, but if I get arrested and charged and convicted of something, then I could lose my residency. So, and I think this speaks to a broader point as well, that the risks for someone getting involved in this sort of thing are very variable depending where you are in the world, what your personal circumstances, etc., etc. So I think that's one thing. I do feel that people are more, researchers and academics are more emboldened than they used to be. And I think Extinction Rebellion was a big trigger for that. So around the time that Extinction Rebellion rose to prominence back in 2019, among the kind of broader research group and network that I'm part of, there was a lot of attention to that, a lot of interest. So I do think there are perhaps a lot of people doing things, not necessarily gluing themselves to things, but, open to, willing to be involved in this sort of thing in one way or another. So, for example, I know there's been quite a lot of research groups around the country who were going along to the Fridays for Future protests and trying to kind of make their presence known as scientists, as climate scientists, and show their support through being there. And there was an interesting study actually published in Nature recently, certainly in the last couple of years, which featured a survey of IPCC authors. So I think it was living, well, obviously not dead ones, but the survey of living IPCC authors. And Nature got something like a 40% response rate. So they had almost half of IPCC authors respond to this. And I was quite surprised at the proportion of people who, among IPCC authors, who are obviously quite, senior in this space, some of them very senior in global terms, who had been involved in advocacy of one sort or another. So it was about 2/5 of IPCC authors had been involved in petitions and letters calling for action, and about a quarter who had got involved in protests. So that's still 3/4 who aren't. And of course, it's an international group of people, but a quarter of that most esteemed group of climate researchers have been involved in protests. So it's probably a lot more common than we think, notwithstanding that actual gluing yourself to things, etc., is certainly the far end of that spectrum.
Okay. This is really to end on. Do you think we are edging towards a growing state of civil unrest, and society is splitting down lines of business as usual, and then another line of, we're struggling because we know we need to reorganize ourselves to almost to exist in a state of climate emergency? Yeah,
that's a really important and obviously massive question. I mean, as someone in the UK looking across the Atlantic, the United States, you think, what the hell is going on there? Is that one of the world's largest democracies, if not the biggest one? Certainly very powerful militarily, economically. Seems like it's starting to fall to pieces a bit, doesn't it? Yeah, I do wonder, where are we in terms of our society? And this applies to the UK too. We have a government which is led by a liar and a lawbreaker. We don't have a particularly representative democracy. I don't think we have a government that at all grasps the risks and the threat from climate change, both to our country, but also to very large numbers of people elsewhere in the world, and both now and in the future. They'll say they do. They'll say the right things, but when it comes to what counts, the actions that are necessary, then they don't take them. And yeah, you've kind of got to ask, at what point does something really give? I think coming back to sort of my own research is on social transformations, we call it, but how we respond as a society and personally to the issues of climate change. I don't think we're really grasping that as citizens at all, really. I think that on the one hand, the wider public do get that climate change is important. It's risen up the issues that are important for people that they worry about, and that's important that it's done that. We've moved past the kind of ridiculous skepticism you used to see in the past about whether this is even a thing or not. Okay, there are still some vestiges of that, but I think most people do get the issues. But in terms of what that implies, in terms of what that means we need to do now and in the next few years, reorganizing our societies, whether that's how we eat, farm, travel, consume, how the economy functions, all of these fundamental things, I think very few people kind of really get those fundamentals. And I think it's hard to grasp, and the earlier part of the discussion, as an academic, what do you really do? You don't get up in the morning and run around the house screaming, climate crisis. You sit in front of a computer, you write emails, you do your paper. So at that sort of visceral, emotional level of the scale and the urgency of change needed, it's hard to get to grips with, I think, and it's so huge and so far-reaching that it's difficult to do so.
Yeah. Okay. Well, look, thank you very much. It's been great to speak to you and very insightful. Hopefully, I'll speak to you again sometime.
Great to speak to you too, and thanks for inviting me along. I'll look at.
Thanks again for listening. If you are interested to help support this series and help expand the discussion around climate topics, then please do consider backing my channel via Patreon. It will help me produce more content, and you will also gain access to more expert interviews. It would be great to engage more with audiences too and understand your views on these topics.